Today is a bright sunny day in Sydney. We are Rani and Bakti from Macquarie University at the Royal Botanic Garden and have a chat with some visitors about some changes in spring.
It's very nice, yes. Botanical gardens are lovely. The colours of the flowers and the trees are beautiful.
It's lovely. Nice time of the year. It's very dry start to spring here. Instead of having rain, it's been very dry.
Spring is very beautiful after the cold winter. Last year we had a lot of rain in month of July, but this year we did not have much rain.
Very good, very good. I'm one of the first who really studied environmental chemistry. Our first experiment was the Georges River. What are the changes in the water system, in the climate, and so on. So of course, we have to be aware of that.
For the country located below the Tropic of Capricorn, like Australia, spring is the season that we might experience differently. Year by year, the Sydneysiders feel that spring has changed in some various ways. There are early blooming, stronger wind, and so on. We may think that these patterns are caused by global warming. How crazy it will be if we do not prepare very well before our nature decade each year. What's going on? Let's hear what the expert would say about our beloved season.
Now we are here at the Centennial Parkland meeting Vanessa Barrett, a science communicator of the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney, to talk with us about some changes at the parks in spring now and then.
What are specifically the changes in spring now compared to years ago?
The other thing to point out is that we've been looking after botanic gardens in Australia for about 200 years. So that's how long we can see patterns and changes. And I actually asked one of the horticulturalists the other day, do you think you've noticed these changes in spring? But it's hard to know exactly whether it's to do with climate change because sometimes cycles of weather can be quite long. It could be 50-year changes. So I don't think anyone's disputing that the dry period we've had this last few months has been one of the worst we've seen at this time of year, and that has definitely affected the spring. I think climate scientists know that the weather is changing to do with climate change. We kind of see things at a much smaller detail. So this spring, one thing I can say to you is that the paper daisies at the Australian Botanic Garden, which all come out and flower at the one time, they've flowered about 3 weeks earlier than normal.
So anticipating the changes and also its impact, what do the management prepare for that?
We have to have a few backup plans because obviously the most important thing is water. So if the weather's changing, if there's a longer dry period, if we're looking at potentially high bushfire danger, things like that, water is our friend and the thing we need to prepare for. So we have a lot of water tanks. We use, here at Centennial Park, we have a pond system that naturally captures water from the surrounding areas. But the other good thing to do is to plant trees that are more adaptable to change. And so we're actually doing quite a lot of research at the moment now on which species will be most affected by climate change. And perhaps maybe we should be planting things that are more resilient to change and can adapt if the weather is a bit strange.
What about the visitors lately?
This spring the ground has been particularly hard and dry. The visitors have commented on the early flowering of some plants. There's not as much food around for birds and bats, or the ponds are very low. But I also heard that there's some rain coming soon.
Do you think global warming has something to do with this change?
If you asked a climate scientist, is this weather we're having related to climate change? They would say, of course it is.
That was Vanessa Barrett, the science communicator of the Royal Botanic Garden, Sydney, joining us in our interview about the changes at parks in Sydney in terms of spring.
Here we are talking with Dr. Linda Buman, a senior lecturer at the Department of Biology, Macquarie University, about how global warming affects spring in what ways.
What can you explain about our spring today?
These are the classic biological fingerprints of that particular season. We see this activity because it's primarily driven by temperature. And if we look over data that's been collected for decades, we can see that over that kind of time period, the trend is for these events to be occurring earlier and earlier. So they're advancing, in other words.
So, how different the spring now from few years ago?
Well, it's not so much a few years ago, but if we go back 3-4 decades, then the difference can be quite considerable. So, for instance, some birds might be migrating up to a month earlier now compared to 30-40 years ago. And if we look at agriculture, crops such as wheat, grapes and other horticultural crops, these are maturing much earlier. So in some ways this is good news for some species, because for those crops that we rely on for food ourselves, if we can get a second crop in, a second harvest in a season, then that can be very advantageous.
Do you think is it caused by global warming?
Yes. Firstly, what we can see is that they're occurring across the world. Secondly, we can see that we are getting consistent responses across very different kinds of organisms. And we know from many laboratory and field studies that there's this relationship between temperature and species life cycles. So there is considerable evidence that global warming is driving these responses.
What long-term effect that can happen to spring in the case of global warming?
So we've got some great data from the Netherlands, for instance, on how earlier flowering or bud burst of plants has affected the life cycles of caterpillars, which have then affected the life cycles of birds. So we can see the effects on a couple of species, but trying to determine what impacts that will have on an ecosystem is very, very difficult.
In the future, what solution that we can do to face those effects?
So ultimately, the best thing to do is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to be more aware of impacts on biodiversity so that we can set in place different management actions to help conserve biodiversity. Species are going to respond to climate change, and we need to work out which species will be the most detrimentally impacted and what we need to do to help facilitate their survival in the long term.
That was Dr. Linda Buman, a senior lecturer at the Department of Biology, Macquarie University, talking with us about the changes in spring and correspond with global warming.